Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. My guest today on One of a Kind, Rawlings, the 17th president of the University of Iowa. He is known as a classic scholar, administrator, and outstanding teacher. President Rawlings authored several scholarly works on ancient Greek history. He served as a referee for a number of scholarly journals, a book review editor, and then editor of the Classics Journal. President Rawlings currently sits on the board of directors of the American Council of Education, is chairman, council of 10 presidents and chancellors of the Big Ten Conference, and a member of the President's Commission of the NCAA. Before coming to Iowa, Rawlings was on the faculty and an administrator at the University of Colorado. While there, he served as a faculty mentor for students working towards the Rhodes Scholarship and was the recipient of a Teaching Excellence Award. At Iowa, in addition to his university duties, he chaired the Governor's Commission on Foreign Language Studies and International Education, served on the Economic Development Board for Iowa and the board of Norwest Bank, Iowa. President Rawlings enthusiastically supports the Writers' Workshop and the visual and performing arts. And recently, he was elected to the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He and his wife Elizabeth have 4 children: Elizabeth, Hunter IV, Ashley, and Hill. In the summer of 1995, he and his family moved to Ithaca, New York, where he assumes the presidency of Cornell University. You were born, I know, in a busy eastern port city of Norfolk, Virginia in 1944. Tell me a bit about your first family and kind of their interests and occupation and how they imprinted you.
I'd be happy to. My father worked for his whole life in the wholesale hardware business. And he grew up in Norfolk, and his father worked for the same company, Waters and Martin Incorporated. And together, my grandfather and my father, who have the same name I do, spent over 100 years working for that hardware company. So I have a high respect for that, but I knew when I was growing up there was one thing I didn't want to do, and that was to go to work for the same company.
Tell me about your mother and her interests.
My mother's from Wilmington, Delaware, and she is a great reader and a student of Romance languages. She majored in French and Italian and Spanish in college, and she's always been interested in literature. And she still sends me books that I ought to read, and most of the time I do.
And you have siblings?
I have 2 younger sisters, Becky, who's 4 years younger, and Anne, who is 9 years younger.
Tell me, President Rawlings, you went to Norfolk Academy and played basketball, I read, and did you ever toy with the idea that you might be an athlete, have that as your vocation?
Well, I played a lot of basketball and baseball and enjoyed them both all the way through college. And my professional opportunities, let's put it that way, were in baseball. And I did have several major league teams interested in possibly signing me to a contract. These were the days before the draft, and they were offering bonus money to 17 and 18-year-olds. And we were pretty impressionable. And we looked at those opportunities sometimes with a lot of excitement. But I decided in the end that I'd prefer to try to go to college and then see what happened on the baseball front.
What or who interested you in the classics?
I think it's pretty clear that my mother did. When I was young, probably 10 or 11 years old, she gave me books on Greek mythology, and by the time I was 12 or 13, a copy of the Iliad to read. I hasten to add in English, not in Greek, and I became interested in the classics that way.
And did you major in classics at Haverford College?
Yes, I majored in classics at Haverford. I had already studied some Latin in high school, and then I added Greek in college, and so I spent a good deal of time with the classical languages.
How do the Greek myths speak to you and how to live your life?
Well, I don't know about how to live my life from the Greek myths, but I will say that they're a great series of stories that help to explain the way the world is. And when you're reading about Athena or Zeus or the other figures of Greek mythology, you do get to see played out a lot of forces, you might say, in the world that the Greeks imagined through these deities, who were anthropomorphic. They were much like human beings, and in fact very much like human beings. They had foibles as well as strong points. And I think those stories are enduring in the world because they do capture, to a great degree, many of the forces that compete with one another in the world even today.
Do you think they have a message for society at large?
Well, I think they have lots of different messages, and one thing you learn about Greek mythology is that it's not a single god or a single divinity. Instead, it's a multiplicity of divinities, and the stories about them are rife with infidelity, with wars and competition and the struggle of the genders, and all the same things that affect us today. And so I think you see in those myths many stories that perhaps can tell us a good deal about ourselves.
When you graduated with honors in classics in 1966, you were off to Princeton, and
Right.
you were on a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, is that right?
Right. Those were the days when there was good fellowship money available to students, and I was very grateful to have a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to do my graduate study because I couldn't have afforded to do it otherwise. My parents had really helped me through college, but my sister Becky was coming along for college by the time I was finished, and we didn't have enough money as a family to send to school at the same time. So I was fortunate enough to win a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and that really did cover my expenses the first 3 years in graduate school, and then in the last year I won a NDEA fellowship, which was a government fellowship, for the final year of study.
What was your dissertation on at Princeton?
My dissertation was on the Greek historian Thucydides, whose name is not one that rolls off everyone's lips very easily, but he was a terribly important factor in my life in the late 1960s because he was the historian of a long and exceedingly bloody war between Athens and Sparta. And we, in the late 60s, were, of course, engaged in a long and very difficult war in Vietnam. And it was of the utmost importance to members of my generation to think about that war and, frankly, to suffer along with those who were fighting in it, and to have very strong political beliefs either in favor of it or against it. And so I found the issues in Thucydides terribly relevant to what we were going through as a society and what I was going through as an individual in his early 20s in America. So for me, Thucydides was not simply an author to study and to learn about so that I could attain my PhD, but he really was a mind that I wanted to come to know to help me understand what was going on in a very contemporary way.
They say that his writing, very few have surpassed it. It was just so brilliant.
He was a very brilliant man, and he's sometimes seen as a very austere intellect because his rhetoric is exceedingly difficult in the original Greek, and he writes in a way that appears to be quite austere and removed from the fray. But in fact, I learned by reading him very carefully and studying him that he had a heart as well as a head. And when he presented some of the issues of the war between Athens and Sparta, he did so in a way that brought out the suffering of both sides in an extremely intense form. And that understanding of suffering in war was something that I learned a great deal from in studying Thucydides.
So after you graduated and got your PhD, you were off to the University of Colorado to teach Thucydides, correct?
Well, yes, I was able to teach Thucydides, which I was very pleased about, but as a young assistant professor, I needed to teach a broad range of classes in the classics. And one of the wonderful things about the field of classics is that it involves not only Greek literature and language, but the Latin language and literature, Greek and Roman history, archaeology, art, mythology, philosophy, all the aspects of Greco-Roman culture. So it gave me an opportunity to teach at a public university across a broad spectrum of courses.
I know you were an outstanding teacher at Colorado and you received an award for your teaching, and I want to quote from a letter to an editor by one of your former students. The student said, "His grasp of the material, his authoritative style, his ability to convey complex information in a manageable form, and his true concern for students place him in a class above even the best professors of his time," end quote. I guess my question to you is, that's pretty heady. What drew you into administration and out of the classroom where obviously you were so good?
Well, I did enjoy teaching tremendously, and I enjoyed the students. That was the main reason that teaching was so much fun for me. But as I continued to teach and to do my own scholarly work at Colorado, I was interested in the broader university. And I sat on various committees that tried to study parts of the university that I didn't know much about, such as the sciences. And I became fascinated with the way faculty members in other disciplines looked at the university, because often it was very different from the way I did. And as a result, I wanted to learn more. And the more I sat on committees and dealt with broader issues, the more I became interested in the work of administrators who were trying to understand all parts of the university. So I guess you could say I was sort of led into it by interest gradually. But I never gave up teaching, and in fact, I continue to teach just about every year here at the University of Iowa.
So now we're to Iowa. You came to Iowa as the 17th president. What were the biggest challenges for you as you came? I remember meeting you 7 years ago, almost this summer. Aside from just taking on a new job in a new community, what were your biggest challenges at the University of Iowa?
Well, when we came here, Elizabeth and I spent the first couple of months traveling around the state, and we visited about 26 communities in Iowa so that we could hear from Iowans their views on the university. Because we didn't know much about Iowa at the time, and we wanted to hear from our constituents and to learn what their communities were all about. And the first question I was asked at every one of these events was, "President Rawlings, why can't my daughter or my son get classes at your university?" And I thought that was an interesting question. And I came back to Iowa City and I asked, why can't students get their classes here? And there were many reasons, but the main one was that we simply didn't have enough faculty members to teach the large number of students who had come into the University of Iowa in the late 80s. And it meant that we had a real problem with our principal customers, you might say, our students. So we've really spent the 7 years working very hard to improve undergraduate education, and I would say that was clearly the biggest challenge.
Is that what you'd like to be remembered for your 7 years here?
Well, it's certainly one thing I would be delighted to be remembered for, because I do think we've made great strides. And now when I ask students on the campus, did you get your classes this semester? The answer invariably is yes, I did. And that's really gratifying because it means we've turned that situation around.
What do you consider the University of Iowa's greatest strengths? What do you think we do best?
Well, there are a lot of strengths here, but the two areas that I often single out are the creative arts and what I call the healing arts, that is the health sciences. And if you ask internationally what is the University of Iowa best known for, I think it's those two things. And the creative arts are represented especially by the Writers' Workshop, which is still, I think, the strongest writing program in the country. And the healing arts are best represented by the colleges of medicine and nursing, dentistry, and pharmacy, and by the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. And in all of those programs I've just mentioned, I think we have programs of international distinction, and that's why people think about those programs when they think about the University of Iowa.
And research, including that in healing arts?
Yes, we do a lot of research here, of course, and especially in the field of medicine. Biomedical research is very strong at the university. But there's a great deal of scholarship and creative work, too, and sometimes that's lost sight of because it's in the sciences that the big grants are usually brought in, Whereas in the creative arts, we're not usually invested with lots of money. That becomes a pretty singular enterprise by individuals who are strolling up and down the Iowa River writing poems and novels and short stories.
I don't know if people know this, but about you, the general public. I talked to Charlie Drum, who's the director of campus communication, and he had written an article about you for the Cornell newspaper, and he had interviewed a staff member and a critic of yours. I think her name is Sue Buckley. And she wrote, or told Charlie Drum, that you have helped create an atmosphere in which staff contributions to the fabric of the university can be appreciated. And you've been gone to the meetings and had that dialogue open.
Yes, I think it's very important to treat staff equally with faculty members, because it's often the staff who make the place go. And sometimes they don't get the credit they should for doing a really fine job. For example, much of the research here at the University of Iowa depends on the work of staff who work in the laboratories, who repair equipment, who are in the front line, you might say, of critical advances in research. And then the entire physical plant depends upon the staff who are so often vital. And we don't really think about them much until we have an emergency. And I think, for example, about the serious flooding we had here 2 years ago, when we absolutely could not have continued to function without the hard work of a number of our staff members.
There are 12,000, I read.
There are lots of staff members here. Some of them are full-time and some of them are part-time. And of course, students fill many of those part-time positions because it's important for them to have employment on the campus. And the Iowa work ethic is legendary. And I think it's one of the reasons that we do so well.
Another thing I don't know if people know, that you've always encouraged students to come in to see you. You say, make an appointment and come on in and let's talk about your concerns. And then you'll see the student 6 weeks down the road on campus and you'll remember their face and name and say, hey, is that problem worked out?
Well, sometimes I can do that, but I do try to encourage students to come by and see me. And most of them, of course, are reluctant to do so. They're shy. Many Iowa students I find are very modest people from smaller towns. And going to the president's office sort of feels like going to the principal's office. In high school, it's not something you want to do. And when the president is 6 feet 7 inches tall, it makes it all the more daunting. So I try to be as personable as possible to make them really feel wanted.
How have you found time to teach?
Well, usually I can't spend a whole lot of time teaching, but I try to teach in the Unified program, which is a program for freshmen and sophomores here. And I do a little teaching in that each fall. And for me, that's very gratifying because it's a chance to see the new students here and find out what's on their mind.
What did you learn at the University of Iowa that you are going to take with you to Cornell University?
I think lots of things, but one of the things is the importance of the real integrity in the population. I've been so impressed by the genuineness of Iowans. They're very real people. They don't like a lot of hype. They want to meet you personally and find out what's on your mind. They're not impressed by glitz. They want to see reality. And I think that all adds up to the word integrity in my book. And I think that I'll carry with me as a real memory of Iowans, because it means that they are genuine people who respect you if you respect them.
Looking back on your 50 years, who or what had a major influence on you? You mentioned your mother reading you and
my whole
you in
family's had a
classics.
great influence on me. We're a very close family in Virginia, and it's a large extended family. And people don't believe me when I tell them, but it's true that every August the family gets together for about a week in the mountains of Virginia, and usually about 100 people show up of every age and stage. And so you have grandmothers and grandfathers and nieces and nephews and uncles and aunts and absolutely everyone. And it's really a refreshing and renewing experience for all of us. We wouldn't miss it for the world.
That's what, is this both sides, the Rawlings, and what was your mother's maiden name?
My mother's maiden name was Trapnell.
trapped in.
And so it is both sides of the family, and it's, as I say, a very large extended family, and we're quite close.
I know you've been at Iowa, getting back to Iowa, a big supporter of the arts, both visual and performing, and the humanities, the Writers' Workshop. Having the Writers' Workshop here has been a big plus for you, hasn't it? You
It
personally,
has.
Personally, too.
That's exactly right. It's not just a matter of professional interest, but when I'm reading the poetry of Jory Graham, or a novel by Frank Conroy, or an essay by Clark Blaze, or James McPherson, I'm very appreciative of what they add to my store of knowledge and emotion, you might say. And then to be able to bump into one of these authors on the street the day after you've been reading her poetry or whatever is a great feeling. And you can talk with her or him and actually go over a passage you've been reading. And for me, that's a great treat. I think it's something we should never take for granted at the University of Iowa.
It's wonderful. I'm going to ask you about the other half of the Rawlings dynamic duo, Elizabeth. She's been a wonderful addition to Iowa, to the University of Iowa, to the state. How did you meet her?
Elizabeth and I are from that same large extended family in Virginia, so we actually met when we were about 9 or 10 years old. So that was a long time ago. And we were quite close as teenagers. We would see each other at that family reunion I talked about, and we talked a lot together because we were the same age, and we had a lot of fun together. But then it took us a long time to get together, and in fact it was only 8 years ago that we were married, and we both feel very fortunate that we had that opportunity later in life.
And you have 4 children. Tell me where they are and what they're about.
We have 4 kids, that's right. The oldest is daughter Liz, who's now 27 years old, and she's just finished a law degree, and she's practicing law in Denver, Colorado. And the next oldest is my son Hunter, who is currently working for a software firm in Boulder, Colorado, after graduating from college a year ago. The next oldest is Ashley, who is also a graduate from college 2 years ago, and she now is in the nurse midwifery program at Columbia University in New York. And the youngest is Hill, who is a sophomore at the University of Colorado. So as you can see, it's hard to keep those kids out of Colorado. 3 out of 4 have returned to Colorado.
Oh, it's that mountain air, isn't it?
I think so.
Oh,
I think
Boulder's
so.
a beautiful town.
It is a beautiful town, and in fact, Liz is going to be married this summer in July, high in the Rocky Mountains, near Rocky Mountain National Park.
Oh, wonderful.
So you can't seem to take Colorado out of those kids.
Oh, that's great. Tell me, I'd love to know how you maintain a balance. You've got so many demands as a university president from students, faculty, staff, alums, the Board of Regents. How do you maintain a balance or relieve a little stress? And what do you like to do to kind of get away from it all?
Well, that's what I call the constituency problem. When you're a university president, especially at a public university, you have many constituencies. And as you say, it's very demanding. And they tend to have different points of view. And so it can be pretty stressful. And if you're a 6'7" tall president, it's very hard to hide. And so it's important to have a little private time. And it's especially important for Elizabeth as well, because she spends a great deal of her time in public. So we try to do walks together. We do quite a bit of that. And we get out with the dog and walk along the Iowa River. And that's often a time when we have what Marvin Bell calls walking thoughts. It seems to be very conducive to thinking and talking and sharing ideas. So we do a good deal of that. And then I used to play a lot of sports, but my back doesn't support as many sports as it used to. But I'm still trying to play a little golf.
Golf. You've given up tennis. You've had to give up tennis.
Tennis
too?
and squash are sort of on hold for a while. I used to play a lot of tennis and squash, especially squash in Iowa, because it's a good bad weather game. And so you can play all through the winter months. And I'm very competitive in those games, and that was a great way of relieving stress. So
Yes.
now I have to find other means. The other thing I really like doing when I have a little spare time is reading. And
I know it, because look at your desk. I mean, this isn't administrative work. This is...
No, I'm sort of inundated with books.